you remember how 1956 began, with Britain in the grip of the coldest weather most of us had ever known? It was as though nature was warning us of the kind of summer we'd be getting. All over Europe, the big freeze-up spread, though Parisians, like ourselves, made the best of it. But ice in the park is one thing, and ice at sea is quite another. Hundreds of square miles of the Baltic were frozen solid. The white blanket descended on New York a few weeks later, but most surprised of all were the people of Rome, where it never snows, or so they thought. In one part of Italy at least, the cold was welcome, at Cortina, where the Winter Olympiad opened the Olympic year. The men's ski jump was a triumph for the Finns, who won first and second places. Snow and ice were a constant hazard on long stretches of the Monte Carlo Rally, the toughest test of cars and drivers in the world. Victory went to a British trio driving a Jaguar, Adams, Bigger and Johnston. Another British triumph was the Comet 3's record-breaking world trip, piloted by Cunningham and Bouga. But as the world shrinks, its problems grow. The troubled island of Cyprus was constantly in the news, sometimes with schoolboy riots, which were ugly but not deadly, and sometimes with murder. The spread of terrorism led to the banishment of the Cypriot leader, Archbishop Macarius. A bright chapter in the early months of the year was the royal visit to Nigeria. And perhaps the most memorable event of that crowded tour was the Royal Durbar at Kaduna, the northern capital, with its exotic dances and its brilliant climax when the Queen and the Duke watched the Jahi Jaj. Aviation history was made by Peter Twiss in the Fairey Delta II, which became the fastest plane in the world at 1,132 miles an hour, smashing the world record by the fantastic margin of 308 miles an hour. The Grand National, watched by 250,000 people, was as thrilling as ever. And for the first time, we filmed it from a traveling camera. The half-dozen favorites included 2 entries by the Queen Mother, Devon Loch and Matu Vu. Over the final jumps, the Queen Mother saw Devon Loch take the lead, clear away from ESB and Gentle Moir. But with 40 yards to go, Devon Loch collapsed, leaving ESB to win. The most amazing finish in Grand National history. When Bulgarin and Khrushchev paid their spring visit to Britain and sat in apparent friendship with our country's rulers, many began to hope the Cold War was thawing for good. Russia had astonished the world by denouncing Stalinism, a move which was to have vast repercussions behind the Iron Curtain. But the future was still a mystery. Another mystery concerned the visiting Russian warships, near which naval frogman Commander Crabb disappeared. Was he spying? The silent service remained silent. The wedding of the year, without any doubt, was the marriage of Prince Rainier of Monaco to film star Grace Kelly. A modern fairy tale which almost monopolized the headlines, at least until the cup final came along to bring us back to normal. White-shirted Birmingham were hot favourites against Manchester City. But what a surprise Manchester gave us. Within 3 minutes, Joe Hayes had put them 1 up. Birmingham equalised, Manchester made it 2-1, and then Bobby Johnston wriggled through for a brilliant third to clinch the victory. What a year for Manchester. United topped the league and City won the cup. But the hero of the match was Bert Trautmann, who defended Manchester's goal with grim courage in spite of a neck injury, which was to put him in plaster for weeks to come. The derby was the wettest for many years, but it takes more than rain to spoil the greatest classic of them all. Once again, there was a big French challenge, a third of the field of 27. Coming into the last furlong, Lavandin was in the lead. Monteval on the outside left his run too late, and Lavandin won by a neck. An historic event was the Queen's review of 300 holders of the Victoria Cross to mark the centenary of that most honoured of all medals. At Wimbledon, the men's singles ended in an all-Australian final with Lou Hode, at the far end, defeating his boyhood friend Ken Rosewall by 3 sets to 1. This pair of 21-year-olds won the doubles too. In the women's singles, Britain's Angela Buxton reached the final but lost to Shirley Fry. Then Len Hutton was knighted, and his tradition was proudly maintained by England's test team, especially Big Jim Laker, who made hay of Keith Miller and the Australians by taking 19 wickets in 2 innings of the 4th test. The 19th was Len Maddox, Laker dispatched him LBW, and the Ashes were England's. Jim Laker's wonderful achievement broke all test records, and everyone came forward to congratulate him, victims and all. From America, the land of new ideas, came one of the oddest yet, a rowboat that flies. Well, why not? Tragedy in the Atlantic. The end of the 29,000-ton Italian luxury liner Andrea Doria, after colliding with a Swedish liner Stockholm in a fog. She sank in a few hours. A disaster which never should have happened. Neither should the dispute which brought to a standstill the giant BMC car factories after 6,000 men had been sacked as redundant. Feelings ran high. The union said there should have been consultation. Some men backed the strike, some didn't. But they joined forces at once when fascist speakers tried to take a hand. That was one kind of intervention nobody wanted. At the Farnborough Air Display, the emphasis was on new jet engines, a field in which Britain has won a leading position and is holding it. One British jet triumph of the year was, strangely enough, not in the air, but on water. Donald Campbell's smashing of his own world speed record in the fabulous Bluebird on Coniston Water. 225 miles an hour. Visitors to Britain? Plenty. But to Liberace's fans, only one who mattered. Then there was Nina, the lady of the 5 hats. She was here quite a while. For the 4-jet Avro Vulcan, largest Delta aircraft in the world, a brilliant round-the-world flight came to a tragic end without warning in a heap of burning wreckage on the runway of London Airport. 4 men lost their lives. But Bomber Command Chief Sir Harry Broadhurst, who was acting as co-pilot, was thrown clear by his ejector seat as the Vulcan crashed. So was the pilot, squadron leader Donald Howard. Years of patient work were crowned with success when the Queen opened Calder Hall and sent its output flowing into the national grid.
It is with pride that I now open Calder Hall, Britain's first atomic power station.
Electricity from atomic power for homes and factories. The beginning of a new era. Meanwhile, halfway around the world in Kenya, the grim Mau Mau chapter was closing with the capture of Dedan Kimathi, the brain behind the terrorists. But with the news from Budapest, the world picture suddenly darkened. Hungary's bid for independence, at first apparently successful, was remorselessly crushed by Soviet tanks. Peaceful coexistence became a mockery as the guns thundered. Russia was denounced, even by former friends. And in the ruins of Budapest, the Cold War was reborn with a vengeance. But when Israel invaded Egypt, Cold War became hot war for a few critical days. Britain and France moved in, declaring that the combatants must be separated, the fighting stopped, and the Suez Canal safeguarded. Commando and paratroop units took control of Port Said and the northern entrance to the canal. The battle was sharp, but brief. Allied troops soon dealt with the pockets of Egyptian resistance, and within a few days, they had the situation in hand. All was quiet in Port Said, but in the councils of the world, opinion was sharply divided. Britain and France accepted a compromise. They would hand over to a United Nations police force, provided it was effective. The UN force was rapidly built up to strength, and as they moved in, the British and French moved out. Their job was done, and brilliantly. They had earned their Christmas at home. But many questions remain unanswered. Their solution will be the United Nations' biggest test. What is to be the future of Egypt and the Suez Canal? 1957 will show. Feeling cold? Perhaps it's because the Antarctic has been in the news all the year. Prince Philip was an early visitor, reminding us that 1957 marked the beginning of the International Geophysical Year. To move to warmer latitudes, this South African observatory has been busy photographing the moon. At the time of going to press, the moon was still on nobody's personal visiting list. But other mysteries of outer space were being probed by Britain's new radio telescope at Jodrell Bank, the largest in the world. For this, above all, was year one of the space age. In America, U.S. Army doctor Major Simons became the highest man in the world by spending a whole day more than 19 miles up in a balloon gondola. But another living being went higher still. Earth's first real space pioneer was a dog, a Russian husky called Laika. The Russians, after astonishing the world by launching Sputnik I, sent Sputnik II into orbit round the world with Laika as passenger. Months of training in lower altitude rockets, sometimes with a companion, prepared Laika for her lonely journey. The last week of the little husky's life put mankind eternally in her debt. For her sacrifice blazed a trail to the stars. Rocket research was pushed ahead in the West too, America giving top priority to the job, and Britain making her own contribution, a much bigger contribution than many people overawed by the Sputniks have realized. The world being what it is, research had to concentrate on defense. Sir William Penny flew to Australia for the British atom bomb tests. But a few months later, off Christmas Island, came a still more spectacular demonstration of military power, Britain's first hydrogen bomb. The blinding glare of a man-made sun lights up man's dilemma. In one decade, he has found the secret which can destroy him and taken the first steps which can lead him into outer space. But the faster man learns how to destroy life, the faster he learns how to preserve it. Stephen Moore's mother, injured at a car smash, was kept 169 days in a deep freeze coma and then bore him safely. Another boy in the news was Prince Charles, who made history by being the first heir to the throne of England to go to school. A sign of the times from a court which, in spite of criticism, is proving it can keep abreast of the times. New faces grow towards manhood and familiar faces say goodbye. Sir Anthony Eden, after a long career in high office, was forced by ill health to leave the highest of all, the Premiership. The strain of the Suez crisis was the last and heaviest load he had to bear, a load which was taken off Britain's shoulders by the United Nations. That was a time full of bitterness and recrimination. But also in Africa, Britain disproved the charge of imperialism by granting independence to the Gold Coast, which started a new life as Ghana. Meanwhile, France had nothing to rejoice about. Violent rioting on the streets of Paris headlined the public anger over events in Algeria, where nationalist revolt was draining the manpower and wealth of France. The year saw the death of the Aga Khan, a figure much loved in both East and West. Many expected his son Ali Khan to succeed to the leadership of 20 million Ismaili Muslims. But the old Aga's will named Ali's son Karim, young and energetic, as the new leader. From Moscow came news of the eclipse of Marshal Zhukov, last major obstacle to Khrushchev's bid for supreme power. His dismissal with others of the old guard was a measure of Khrushchev's growing strength, for Zhukov was the hero of the Red Army and the most popular man in Russia, not to mention being well respected abroad. Sports news. At Wimbledon, Althea Gibson became the first of her race to win the women's title. Runner-up Darlene Howard congratulates her. Another female victory. Denmark's Greta Andersen winning the cross-channel race. Of the 22 swimmers who set out from France, only 2 made it. On the male side, Derek Ibbotson lowered the mile record by nearly a second at the White City. And what a race that was. Derek's time, 3 minutes 57.2. And the next 3, Ron Delaney, Jungwirth of Czechoslovakia and Ken Wood, were all inside the 4 minutes. For Stanley Matthews, it was a year of honors. Not only was he crowned King of Soccer during a visit to Ghana, but rather more sedately, he received a well-earned CBE at Buckingham Palace. Over to the golf links at Lindrick, where Britain won a surprising triumph in the Ryder Cup. Di Reese and his wonder team beating the Americans for the first time for 24 years. Britain was challenging another foreign monopoly too, the dominance of Italian cars in Grand Prix racing. Right on their own home ground, in the Italian Grand Prix at Monza, Stirling Moss defied the Ferraris and Maseratis and drove a British Van Wall to victory. Later in the year, Maserati announced their withdrawal from Grand Prix and sports car racing for economy reasons. But perhaps they read the omens as the laurel wreath went round Stirling's neck. And round Katie Molson's finger went Stirling's wedding ring. Good luck to them both. A glance at the general news. The Oxford Street fire, from which, thanks to the presence of mind of ordinary passers-by, several girls working on upper floors had very narrow escapes. Less fortunate were the victims of a rush hour disaster in the same street, when a bus driver had a blackout and his huge vehicle ploughed into a bus queue, killing 7 and injuring many more. Britain's Catholic community celebrated the enthronement of Dr. William Godfrey as Archbishop of Westminster, succeeding Cardinal Griffin. A great chapter in the history of the sea came to a sad close when the sailing ship Pamir went down in an Atlantic gale with the loss of 82 lives. One of the last of the great windjammers, she had been sailing the oceans for more than half a century, earning her living first as a merchantman, then as a training ship for German cadets. The world mourned a fine ship and the men and boys who perished with her. A strange occurrence near Bolton, where a hole yawned in the street, houses collapsed, and 400 people had to be evacuated. The most spectacular event of the royal year was the visit of Queen Elizabeth and the Duke of Edinburgh to the United States. The young Queen won every American heart. She so obviously enjoyed every minute of it. Mayflower II joined in the New York welcome. She certainly earned the right to be there by her adventurous repeating of the original Pilgrim Fathers' voyage. And the great nation the Pilgrim Fathers helped to found showed that when it comes to rolling out the red carpet, they leave everyone else standing. Broadway's ticker-tape welcome was, to put it mildly, quite something. So high did the winds of New York carry the man-made snowstorm that it was still around the Queen at the top of the Empire State Building. The White House gave the world a moment of alarm with the illness of President Eisenhower. But fortunately, he recovered quickly. Prime Ministers Macmillan of Britain and Gaillard of France met to discuss North Africa. Oil was at the back of French thoughts. The King of Morocco and the President of Tunis offered to mediate in Algeria, but France was in no mood for mediation. Anti-British and anti-American riots followed our supply of arms to Tunisia, which France feared might find their way into rebel hands. But it was a quarrel among friends. The royal visit to Paris was the best demonstration of our French neighbors' basic feelings towards Britain. The capital's warm and brilliant hospitality was typical of the fundamental unity of the peoples whose histories have run parallel. A unity of heritage that will still be there when the feuds and furies of today have long been forgotten. Into New Zealand waters sailed the ship bringing the leaders of the Trans-Antarctic expedition back in triumph. Sir Edmund Hillary and Dr. Vivian Fuchs were heroes of an achievement ranking high in exploration history. They had crossed the South Polar Continent, and now Lady Hillary and Mrs. Fuchs were with their husbands again. There too were some of the huskies used by the expedition, on which for nearly 1,000 miles the explorers traversed Antarctica by way of the pole itself. Meanwhile, back home, the Jodrell Bank radio telescope focused on the moon. Astronomers at the Royal Observatory Herstmonceux applied their visual telescopes, for the moon was the target. What it really is like might be known as the rocket got there. Attempts on the moon have failed so far, but knowledge unbounded may be won before long. The universe is opening to the space age. By contrast, below the North Polar ice sailed Nautilus, the American atomic-powered submarine. 116 men under Commander Anderson voyaged nearly 2,000 miles, surfacing after being under ice for 96 hours. The voyage, ending at Portland, changed the whole concept of war and peacetime navigation too. Harwell scientists made the year's biggest advance of all, Zeta promising, perhaps in the near future, unlimited power. Zeta applies the principles of the H-bomb to obtain the power from seawater. Meanwhile, jet power went further ahead. The Comet 4 went into the Atlantic service. Crossing in just over 6 hours, Comet spanned the ocean in less time than trains take from London to Cornwall. Riots in London and other cities blotted the hitherto fine record of Britain in racial relations. Firm action by the authorities quickly stamped out the trouble. The bus strike spelt trouble of another kind, and for 7 weeks London managed without buses, and in fact got along far better than anybody had thought possible. Throughout that period, everybody got to work and home again. People had to use cars more, resulting in added pressure on space already overcrowded. So the police got busy and did a brisk trade in towing and driving cars away. Traffic slimming was the obvious solution. Smithfield Market was the scene of London's worst fire since the wartime Blitz. Above the blazing basement, a lot of work somehow went on. At one time, it looked as though the whole market would be destroyed. The most dramatic moment, the Poultry Hall Tower crashed down. The crash of a plane at Munich caused the blackest day ever known in English sport. Survivors, men of Manchester United, returning from Belgrade, lay in hospital. 7 of the club were killed. To Professor Maurer and his staff, Matt Busby and the others who recovered owe their lives. And almost as if by a miracle, at Wembley, Matt Busby was in his place for the cup final. Against white-shirted Bolton, Manchester United were fighting for the cup. What a comeback for a shattered team. They lost, but how gallantly. And Shirley Holmes, how gallant she was. The girl with a hole in her heart married the Italian she loved. Baghdad, tragedy in Iraq. King Faisal and his uncle, who was regent before Faisal came of age, were both assassinated. It sparked off trouble throughout the Middle East. With inflamed mobs on the rampage, anything might happen. Americans landed in Lebanon at the request of the government there. By their prompt action, bloodshed was averted. In Amman, too, were rumors of pending revolution. Perhaps King Hussein's palace, its flag at half-mast for Faisal, would witness assassination also. So British troops were invited by Hussein to police Jordan. And there, too, violence did not take place. How different in Cyprus. Terrorism stalked through that island all the year. To Government House in August went the Prime Minister. Sir Hugh Foot and he discussed plans, and the troops continued their thankless, dangerous job. Casualties mounted. When would it end? At home it is a brighter story. Epsom, the derby. After rounding Tattenham Corner, it was a race to thrill 500,000 people. Through an opening on the rails, Charlie Smirk took hard-ridden into the lead, and there he stayed. That veteran jockey of 52 was winning his 4th derby. Nothing on 4 legs could catch hard-ridden. Smirk had him home by 5 handsome lengths. Motor racing hero of 1958 was that gay cavalier Mike Hawthorne. He became world champion. The runner-up, Sterling Moss. Donald Campbell raised his own world water speed record. On Coniston Water, he achieved 248.6 miles an hour. A record to be proud of indeed. For the Territorial Army, it was Golden Jubilee year, and the Queen inspected 8,000 of them in a giant review in Hyde Park. Nothing could mar the grand march past, but the rain had a very good try, and how. Very old sweats, looking on, remembered drenching days at Passchendaele and the Somme. It was the shape of things to come. Much of Britain had the wettest summer for 50 years. The man whose country territorials fought in 2 world wars, President Heuss, came to Britain on a state visit. The Federal Republic of Western Germany is now an ally. A turn of events few people foresaw 10 years ago. Cardinal Roncalli was crowned Pope John the 23rd and the 263rd legitimate successor to the throne of St. Peter. Fully 200,000 people acclaimed the new pontiff in St. Peter's Square. Temporal power was attained in France by General de Gaulle. He was the alternative to anarchy. To his wartime colleague, Sir Winston Churchill, he gave warmest greetings. Their old disagreements forgotten, only their successful collaboration remembered. The General conferred upon Sir Winston the Cross of Liberation, the highest French honor to which a foreigner can aspire. The opening of Parliament by the Queen was in 1958 memorable for a new reason. It was filmed for the first time. Thus, millions at home and abroad beheld the time-honored pageantry of the monarch meeting her legislators. In constitutional monarchy and parliamentary government rest those democratic liberties which are the best safeguard of world peace.
Most credit for starting a thaw in the Cold War belongs to the Prime Minister. Independently, Mr. Macmillan went to Moscow, knowing that further stalemate might bring disaster unparalleled. And though few at the time thought good would come of it, the Moscow trip gave the first lift to the Iron Curtain. Also going there independently, Lord Montgomery had a heart-to-heart talk with Mr. Kay. He went unofficially, but probably did some good where plain speaking is respected. In hospital in Washington, John Foster Dulles, implacable enemy of communism, was a dying man when the Premier saw him. An honest man, Dulles, sometimes forgetting perhaps that politics are never more than the science of the possible. When Eisenhower came to Britain, no longer with Dulles at his elbow, he began his own efforts to end the Cold War. He was a most welcome guest at Balmoral of the Queen. Her Majesty had already told him she was expecting a baby in the new year. A pleasing reminder, this happy news, that life goes on regardless of international politics. Jointly with the Queen, the President opened the St. Lawrence Seaway. One of man's biggest achievements, it virtually brings the Atlantic seaboard to the heart of the North American continent. Proof also that life holds far more than high politics. And the air holds more than rockets. A service round the world in 80 hours by Comet and Britannia was begun by BOAC. In terms of travel time, how the world shrinks. On the new route, Tokyo had one topic, the royal wedding. Westernized, defeat apparently forgotten, the 9 millions in the Japanese capital still look towards the royal palace with religious awe. The Crown Prince married a commoner, the first such marriage in Japan's long history. As they drove through the city after the wedding, all Tokyo rejoiced. All, that is, except one fanatical anti-royalist. He got short shrift. The royal pair remained wonderfully calm. Another royal wedding took place in Brussels, where Prince Albert, the King's brother, took for his lovely bride, with full family approval, Princess Paola of Italy. Belgium is wondering when Prince Albert's example will be followed by the King himself. But from Lhasa, Tibet, another ruler was in flight. Chinese forces swooped down on the capital, and to avoid capture, the spiritual head of the Tibetan people, the Dalai Lama, fled to India. China proved that by no means all the communist world wanted peace. In Cuba, on the other side of the earth, one tyranny was overthrown, apparently by another. But this rise of rebel leader Fidel Castro was a local disturbance, and they simmer down, even in Cyprus. Makarios returned with a peace plan hammered out in London. Then America, wonder of wonders, received Khrushchev. And what would Stalin and Dulles have thought to see the red flag in Washington? The Iron Curtain was lifting indeed. Kay reiterated his plea for a summit meeting before seeing, as much as time allowed, of the United States, farms as well as factories. That Kay's mission was highly successful was mainly owing to the tact of his genial host. The diplomatic ice was melting as, through real ice, emerged Nautilus, the US atomic submarine. Nautilus' voyage under the North Pole probably indicated the future of merchant ships going at speed below surface where there are no storms. And on the surface, or rather skimming a foot or so above it, the hovercraft crossed the channel. No recent invention has made so wide an impression. This British achievement may change the face of water transport. To surface-bound drivers, the M1 was the shape of many such roads to come. No traffic jams, no mile-an-hour crawl, with cars capable of 100. Road making sense at last. In motor racing, it was Britain's year. 300,000 saw the Le Mans 24-hour classic. At the wheel of an Aston Martin, the winner was Roy Salvadori. At Aintree, the 12th British Grand Prix was won in a Cooper Climax by Jack Brabham, by this time hoping to be world champion. And sure enough, Brabham clinched the matter at Sebring, Florida, a worthy world champion driver. Over at Indianapolis, the famous 500 mile, raced on the world's most dangerous track, a pack of thrills, more crack-ups than usual. On water, needless to say, Donald Campbell remained undisputed king, raising the record this time to 260 miles an hour. Campbell attended the dinner in honor of fellow sportsman, world champion driver Mike Hawthorn. No one dreamt that gay evening that tragedy was on the prowl. In a road crash only a day or two later, Mike Hawthorn, the gay cavalier, was killed. Another great sportsman fated was Billy Wright, now retired after playing for England 105 times. Billy Wright, very much with honor in his own country. But every paper by this time mentioned the summit. President Eisenhower, no longer held back by Dulles, was willing to take part with his allies in a top-level meeting with Khrushchev. But who would represent Britain? Macmillan declared the nation. The general election returned the government to power with an increased 100 majority. So, still at number 10, the Prime Minister was Great Britain's Man of the Year. And across the Channel, 1959 was the year of President de Gaulle. Difficult in negotiation, impossible to bluff or intimidate, he has given France political stability and made her once more a power to be reckoned with. When Eisenhower called at Paris on his way home, de Gaulle discussed the Western summit he was insisting on before the summit proper. Not an easy man, de Gaulle, but not one to ignore. Also smoothing the path to the Western summit and sympathetic towards de Gaulle is our own Prime Minister. Meanwhile, man's eyes were fixed on the moon. In the supreme scientific achievement of our time, Russian rockets first hit the moon, then photographed the side always hidden from the world. But as man's fate is settled on Earth, not yet in space, the summit meeting is the political objective. And Western unity, without which there would be little hope, was underlined at Chequers, and then, with his wartime colleagues at the US ambassador's residence, Ike was host. They all knew that Eisenhower, Macmillan and Khrushchev can remove fear, banish war, and lead the world to its just inheritance, a lasting peace.
Long before he stood by the awesome Victoria Falls, the Prime Minister contemplated his timely warning that the wind of change was blowing over the whole African continent. Moving on to the latest showpiece of the Rhodesias, the Kariba Dam, he may have reflected on the contrast between constructive genius and man's political immaturity. For in the Central African Federation, as elsewhere, strife between white man and colored can be ignored no longer. Witness the attitude of Nyasaland, the third member of the Federation. At Blantyre, Dr. Banda's supporters much in evidence. Upon the Union of South Africa, stronghold of the apartheid policy, no noticeable impact was made by the Prime Minister. Their own Premier, Dr. Fairfoot, is unshakable on the racial question. His party popularity was heightened after he survived an assassination attempt. He was opening an agricultural show when a white man shot him in the face. Plainly in Africa, 1960 was going to be a difficult year. Opera House guests at Covent Garden knew that for General de Gaulle, too, anxious months were ahead. On his state visit, the Queen and her people welcomed him back to England. For a few hours, perhaps, he forgot Algeria. In Algeria's neighbor, Morocco, the town of Agadir was wiped out by earthquake and tidal wave. 12,000 people died. Nature was showing that she, too, can practice total war. In Glasgow, disaster of another kind. A whiskey store ablaze. 19 firemen killed, damage close on £10 million. Again, Africa became the world's trouble center. No sooner had Belgium granted the Congo independence than anarchy swept the unhappy country. Who was to govern? Lumumba took office only to find that armed rivals swarmed the political stage, the streets of Leopoldville a battleground. Russia gave lip service to Lumumba and declared the United Nations responsible for the civil war. Then Moscow reaped the propaganda harvest of all time. The spy plane trial of American pilot Francis Powers brought down on Soviet soil. Present were his wife, father, and mother. The sentence was 10 years. So to the United Nations in arrogant high spirits went Khrushchev to attack America for spying, you know itself over the Congo, and for good measure, Dag Hammarskjöld.
As for the Secretary General, I would like to associate myself and my country with the wide expression of confidence in his energy, resourcefulness, and above all, integrity.
Meanwhile, America's nuclear submarine Washington was at sea, armed with 16 Polaris missiles. What a triumph when the first was successfully fired from under the sea. Perhaps Polaris is the complete deterrent. Britain's first nuclear sub Dreadnought was launched by the Queen. Now the defense of freedom comes from beneath the waves. Dreadnought was the name of the first battleship of the modern era, launched before World War I. Who then would have dreamt that the main striking force would one day operate underwater? And who a year ago thought the swastika would be seen again? But reappear it did, and many asked themselves uneasily, would new Nazis arise to scourge the world again? Pathé News surveyed the menace in a film which won the gold medal awarded by the Council of Europe. A royal year in many ways was 1960, and the first newsreel pictures of baby Prince Andrew were taken at Balmoral. To the Shah of Persia was born a son, the male heir for which he and his country waited so long. Queen Farah was blessed where two previous wives were less fortunate. And in Washington, the name was John F. Kennedy, the young Democrat elected president after 8 years of Republican rule. Gone, alas, from the Labour Party in Parliament is the brilliant Nye Bevan, cancer victim at 62. To the great Lord George, a statue was unveiled in Cardiff by the Prime Minister, who compared him with Pitt and Churchill as a war leader of highest rank. But in peace, too, Lloyd George was no less great. What would he have thought, one wonders, of the St. Pancras eviction? He was a doughty fighter for the underdog, but no respecter of anarchy. The strike of seamen holding up the Queen Mary and many other ships cost the nation millions before it petered out. Inconvenience to Atlantic passengers on the big liners was only part of the deplorable story. All roads led to Rome in 1960, Olympic Games here. That great Australian Herb Elliott, here winning the 1,500 meters, was outstanding among the world champions. Herb Elliott, greatest middle distance runner of all time. All Huddersfield turned out to cheer its own gold medal winner, Anita Lonstra. She gained the award in the breaststroke swimming event. When into the Olympic Stadium burst Don Thompson, Britain cheered another gold medal. In the broiling heat, Don won the 50 kilometers walk, winning by 60 yards. Triumphant walker of another kind was Dr. Barbara Moore. John O'Groats to Land's End, 23 days. 18-year-old Wendy Lewis also accomplished the 1,000-mile feat, taking a bit longer.
Land's End gave her a great reception. Sport of another kind. Fighter brawl. Brian London versus Dick Richardson. London's eye was badly cut. The referee thought he'd retired. Richardson was declared the winner. London's vigorous protest set off the liveliest free-for-all ever seen in the ring. All very amusing for the spectators, but not a credit to the sport. The Boxing Board of Control fined London £1,000. Politics can provide a scuffle now and then, especially in Japan. Several members disliked the proposed treaty with America. Poor Mr. Speaker had to be dragged to his chair before the treaty could be ratified. He finally made it. In Birmingham, there was agreement all round when Charlie Lee pushed the boat out in a new way. Free joints to all his customers. Explanation, he'd won $250,000 on the pools. What a sportsman. At Westminster Abbey, what a wonderful day. The wedding of Princess Margaret and Mr. Anthony Armstrong-Jones. And how unforgettably lovely she looked in her gown of white silk organza of classical design, affectionately watched by the congregation of nearly 2,000. To all in the Abbey and to the multitudes outside, this was indeed a day of joy, an event for which 1960 will long be a treasured memory. To the Princess and her husband, the whole British Commonwealth wished a married life of all possible happiness. It's a good life on the whole that we enjoy in the 20th century. Superlatively good for yachtsmen battling their way here in the Tasmania race. Good, too, for Aussies who don't aspire to own yachts. Witness Sydney's lifesavers in the annual Surf Carnival. And in York Minster, how good life was that day when the young Duke of Kent married Miss Catherine Worsley. On that June day, no one had time to think of 1961 as the year of the Great Threat. No one, that is, in York. But in West Berlin, where they've lived for years with peril on the doorstep, the menace heightened. By Kremlin orders, East Germany threw up a wall which today pitilessly divides the former capital, separates wives from husbands, mothers from children. This is the situation which could, if madness prevailed, explode into World War III. While tension mounted in Berlin, Russia resumed nuclear bomb testing. The tests had no military purpose. They were a crude way of scaring neutrals into believing that the safe course is to toe the Kremlin line. And if Mao Zedong could be persuaded also, so much the better. But behind all this is the possibility that nuclear testing will harm generations yet unborn. Hence, in Trafalgar Square, ban the bomb was the demand of passive resistors. They represented millions, some famous like John Osborne and the forthright dramatist Sheila Delaney, asserting that life is our right. UN Secretary Dag Hammarskjöld, working for peace in another way, was killed in the round of duty. His plane crashed in Rhodesia. That dedicated man died for mankind. With a general strike, the year began for Belgium. An illustration that peacetime has troubles enough without war adding to them. Life is our right, but no one expects it to be all honey. Not in Algeria, certainly, where what they call a limited war has plagued France for 7 years. Not even de Gaulle knows how to end it. Paris at one stage expected an invasion led by mutinous generals from Algeria. Fortunately, it never happened. Strife or no strife, love finds a way. Jersey proved that honeymooners don't always want to be by themselves, provided that the hotel has newlyweds only. They'd had a tiring day. Goodness, look at the time, 17 minutes to 10. King Hussein of Jordan married again. His bride, an English girl, Tony Gardner. Life is their right, too. It's never too late to marry. How Camberwell cheered Sidney Fane. He said he was 102, the bride a mere 73. Then the birth certificate proved Sidney was no more than 79. Still, mistakes happen in the best regulated romances. In recognized sports, a vintage year. Stirling Moss won the Monaco Grand Prix. At Goodwood, he won the TT for the 7th time. And what a race for the Indianapolis 500 mile. 200,000 watched 33 drivers in that death-defying event. It gets more hair raising every year. 5 cars came to grief in a chain reaction pileup. In the Derby, sensation of another kind. Victory for a 66-1 outsider. Sidium, a freak result, blamed on the bone-hard going. But everyone praised the brilliant riding of French jockey Roger Poncelet. His first win in 9 derbies. A grand horse and a very proud owner. At the White City, it was goodbye to the great Gordon Pirrie, at any rate as an amateur. The match was England versus Russia. In a grandstand career finish, he brilliantly won the 5,000 meters. A wonderful athlete. In the test matches, that formidable bowler Davidson played a big part in helping Australia to retain the Ashes. Richie Benaud and his men played sporting cricket, and the policy paid off. Earlier at Wembley, Tottenham Hotspur won the cup and became the team of the century. Bobby Smith scored the first goal. Leicester City had no answer to these Spurs. A good pass put Dyson in possession. Goal number 2. Already league champions, Spurs had won the double for the first time in 63 years. And on that day, how good life was for Danny Blanchflower and his wonder team. Life was good too in the Commonwealth. Sierra Leone, Britain's oldest colony in West Africa, became independent. Representing the Queen, the Duke of Kent conveyed the Independence Declaration to Premier Sir Milton Margai. The Queen herself toured India, Pakistan and Persia, seeing the infinite variety of the gorgeous East. The Maharaja of Benares was Her Majesty's host on this occasion. 11 Commonwealth premiers met at Lancaster House, and this time there was a note of regret. For South Africa was leaving the British family of nations. The new republic was proclaimed in Pretoria. Hopes were high in Washington when John Kennedy was inaugurated, the youngest man ever to be elected President of the United States. Millions believed that the West now had a man who would stand firm in face of the threat to humanity. If only all unofficial ambassadors were as friendly as Yuri Gagarin, first man to go into orbit. Britain certainly took him to its heart. In this field, America is rapidly catching up. First, the U.S. rocketed a man into outer space 115 miles high. He was Commander Alan Shepard. He returned no worse for the experience. At the annual Red Square parade, the Kremlin felt very much on top of the world, with Yuri Gagarin still very much the hero. No qualms over poisoning the atmosphere or rattling the saber in Berlin. But tragedy can come without war. It came to Croydon. 33 boys killed in an air crash in Norway. 6 other holidaymakers died at Chamonix when a jet plane cut the Mont Blanc cable railway. 81 people were trapped all night. Their rescue seemed a miracle to them. An avalanche in the Salzburg Alps killed 3 climbers. How puny men seem confronted with the wrath of nature. how puny we often seem when trying to solve our own difficulties. Thousands of builders went on strike over a tea break. The year seemed to be a succession of strikes, most of them more serious than this. The teachers admittedly agitated with some good reason, demonstrating outside NUT headquarters. They maintained that they had a raw deal over the pay falls. Fortunately, no strike. So all in all, we're grateful to the jokers who give us the unexpected laugh. Cyrus B. Tycoon Jr. built his own boat just to show he could do it. And thanks also to the rock and roll talent who got together at the Lyceum for the National Championships. Going one better there was the twist. Life goes on. One birth pleased everyone. At Clarence House, Princess Margaret had a son. She had faith that the future is good. And if everyone has faith, it will be. The princess was a very happy mother when she and Lord Snowdon left Clarence House to take the baby home. As for faith, there was plenty in evidence when 90,000 attended service at the Patrician Congress in Dublin, showing that mankind still cherishes values other than material. Life must go on, and high over Farnborough, airmen perhaps could see the world in right perspective. We must resolve that this pleasant land, indeed all lands, shall not be destroyed. Life is our right. Pilots of philosophical turn of mind, brilliantly displaying the latest in Britain's aircraft industry at Farnborough, might have reflected on how bewildering are the contrasts in the world below. So much that's good, alongside so much bad. Nothing perhaps new in that, nor exclusive to Britain, but striking nonetheless as we look back over 1962. Certainly to the British aviation industry, an exciting year, with faster-than-sound passenger travel a big step nearer. Aviation's allied industry, the motor trade, had a lot to show, new and well tried. But behind the glittering shop window, discontented labor bedeviled the industry, particularly at Ford. The huge plant has been slowed down time after time, sometimes halted. Even Ford's, warned the directors, could bleed to death. How different the nurses, underpaid and overworked, they just marched to bring their case to public notice. There was no strike. But for one day, there was a railway cease work, and the country had to get along as best it could. In this day and age, can we afford it? Of course, the rich and enterprising bypass most difficulties. Independent of railways, one young man went to school by air, flown by an old boy. Prince Charles began public school life at Gordonstown, following in father's footsteps. Disturbingly, in '62, reappeared a public figure few expected to see again, Sir Oswald Mosley. His presence had the expected effect of provoking riotous behavior. It's for the authorities to work out how far free speech can go without stirring up race hatred. No racial trouble in Jamaica, whom Britain steered to independence. Princess Margaret represented the Queen, and the country became a free and full member of the Commonwealth. Uganda, too, achieved independence, and there the Duke of Kent deputized for the Queen. In the province of Buganda, the Kabaka, well known in England, welcomed the Duke and Duchess. At home, rampaging nature thoroughly enjoyed herself in the stormy beginning of the year. Hong Kong was swept by the full fury of a Far Eastern typhoon. Nearly 200 people lost their lives. 75,000 were homeless. If baby Bulu, looking rather sorry for itself, doubted if this was the best planet to come to, small wonder. Too young to do the twist, but what a rage that became. Proof that the young ones know how to enjoy themselves. 700 packed the 59 Club to welcome Princess Margaret and screamed their heads off for the star of the evening, Cliff Richard. Some other young men let themselves go at Richmond. It was the hospital's rugby final. More than anything, it's been the year of the astronauts, with Colonel Glenn, the first American to orbit the Earth. Later on, Colonel Walter Schirra won the applause of the whole Western world by making 6 orbits. Spaceflight being still in its infancy, the astronauts gambled their lives for the benefit of science and mankind. It's a bit of a come down from space to man-powered flight, but in Britain, John Wimperney did manage to get off the ground, confident somebody will win the £5,000 prize with a 1-mile level flight. Already practical, the hovercraft made its commercial bow as a ferry between Rhyl and Wallasey. For the consecration of Coventry Cathedral, 1962 will be remembered in history. In this Christian edifice, the Queen was at the head of a congregation of 2,000. Edinburgh not only drew the cultured world to its festival, it staged the visit of King Olaf of Norway. Long-suffering Berlin had a melancholy anniversary, the first year of the wall. It confesses communism's failure to give freedom and happiness to the East Germans. Filmed here, a boy shot dead, trying to escape to the West. A natural enemy, smallpox, alarmed the whole country. Bradford, one of the worst-hit cities, quickly vaccinated 200,000. Other big towns followed suit. Unfortunately, the outbreak was got under control. As motoring affects everybody, there was general interest in a demonstration that safety belts are real lifesavers. Donald Campbell, saved by a belt when Bluebird crashed, needed no convincing. What of other famous drivers in '62? Sterling Moss, racing at Goodwood, seemed all set for another win. Since Fangio retired, Sterling has been the sport's top personality. And then he crashed, his life in the balance for several weeks. What a relief when he was up and about again. Motor racing's marvel of the year is Graham Hill. And for sheer speed, Donald Campbell's the name. He showed the new Bluebird to the fans. A glimpse of Ireland and 3 presidents together, Sean O'Kelly, Eisenhower and De Valera. What unexpected roles were played by India? First, the conqueror of Goa. Second, the victim of invasion herself by the Chinese. India mobilized, but without effect against the Chinese. The whole world was surprised when Pekin offered a ceasefire. But it was Cuba, not India, that really jolted the world. US planes discovered that Russia was installing rockets on Castro's Island. American warships blockaded Cuba, and Russia took the missiles away. The Kremlin bluff was called, and for that, 1962 hailed President Kennedy as Man of the Year. Salute, too, emerging after weeks in hospital, an earlier fighter for freedom, victorious this time over a broken thigh. For another man setting an example in '62, here touring South America, the Duke of Edinburgh, untiring in service to the nation, giving new force and meaning to that old expression, Royal Ambassador, acclaimed in Bogota as everywhere on that tour. More recently, the Duke opened the Commonwealth Games in Perth. He saw that wonder sprinter Dorothy Hyman win 2 goals. Space allows us only a glimpse of the games. Chivalrously, we confine it to some of the girl gold medalists. Linda Ludgrove won the 110 yards backstroke and the 220. Anita Lonsborough, the 110 and 220 breaststroke and the 440 medley, 3 goals. When Linda Ludgrove went back to school, she was the heroine of the year, back from Australia with 2 gold medals and a silver. One young woman will never forget the year, 1962. '63 was born below zero, but it's the blessing of our temperate climate that extremes never last long. This one only stayed for 3 months. As week succeeded week, we fortunately didn't know it at the time, but that terrible weather was to be an omen of a stormy year. But there was no hint of that as the Queen made her tour of Fiji, New Zealand and Australia. Her Majesty was received everywhere with the fervour to which she is accustomed, but which renews itself and remains fresh on every royal and Commonwealth occasion. That potent Fiji drink carver she took in her stride. Whatever lay in store on Earth, it was a marvelous year in space. Just look at this, the blast-off at Cape Canaveral of American cosmonaut Gordon Cooper. After 34 hours in space and 22 orbits of the Earth, his capsule descended as planned, and he was acclaimed everywhere. This year, the Russians had a girl in space, Valentina Tereshkova. With cosmonaut Colonel Bakovsky, what a reception she got. The father of all the Russias gave them both a great, big, huggy bear of an embrace. An older statesman than Khrushchev, Winston Churchill, took his wife to lunch on her birthday with their daughter Mary. That was on one of the year's better days. On one of its worst, Henley. Who'd have thought the Royal Regatta would ever be like this? It might have been a battlefield in a bad autumn. Heroes of that terrible day were the University of London 8, resoundingly beating the Americans' Cornell. At soccer, England looked like World Cup winners when they took on the rest of the world to mark the centenary of the Football Association. None of the 100,000 crowding Wembley will ever forget that game. Jimmy Greaves got the winning goal only 3 minutes from time. With water everywhere that summer, it's appropriate to look at the SRN2 as it inaugurated a Bristol Channel ferry service between Weston-super-Mare and Penarth, near Cardiff, clipping more than half an hour off the steamer time. Rome. Not only Catholics, but the whole Western world mourned Pope John, who had won a place in the affection of millions. He was succeeded by the Archbishop of Milan. The coronation was held in the open for the first time in the modern history of the Church, as St. Peter's was set out for the Vatican Council. The new pontiff took the title Pope Paul VI. In Westminster Cathedral, Catholics saw John Carmel Keenan enthroned as Archbishop of Westminster, leader of the Roman Catholic Church in Britain. The state visit of King Paul of Greece and Queen Frederica caused one of the minor excitements of the year. When they visited the theatre, demonstrators demanded the release of Greek political prisoners. The husband of Mrs. Betty Ambatielos may soon be free. To our royal family and their guests, it was all rather embarrassing. But on the whole, the Greek visit went off well. In Britain, we mistakenly tend to think that our own ideas of political freedom can flourish on any soil. Politics at home suffered a grievous blow in the death of Hugh Gaitskell. In the prime of life, perhaps within reach of power, he died. A great loss to his party and the nation. So to Moscow to discuss world affairs with Khrushchev went Harold Wilson, the man who stepped up to Labour Party leadership. The year's most important occasion at the Kremlin was the signing of the anti-nuclear test ban. No one there guessed that before the year ended, Lord Hume would be Prime Minister. At Chilham Castle, most people thought Mr. Macmillan looked better. That Profumo business surely had blown over. The Swans at Stratford-on-Avon cared nothing either way. Jack Profumo had resigned as the town's MP, and to Westminster, in his place, the by-election sent Angus Moore. Political normality was almost restored. Perhaps the episode was over. When at last Lord Denning published his report, people waited till midnight for the sale to begin. Most of the eager buyers were disappointed. The report found that there was nothing badly wrong with our public life. So the government came out of it unscathed. Unfortunately, Mr. Macmillan was taken ill, and from hospital he sent his resignation to the Queen. Her Majesty graciously went to consult him. Whom now should she ask to form a government? We all know who today occupies number 10. No longer Lord Hume. He had renounced his title, and as Sir Alec Douglas Hume, he sits in the Commons. It's been a checkered year in the air. There was a mishap on the Florida bomb ring. A delayed action bomb burst prematurely. How glad the pilots were they had ejector seats. Another lucky pilot had an escape on the U.S. carrier Coral Sea. A Sky Warrior broke her nose wheel. The pilot went up again and received orders to crash land on the deck. He was Commander Morris, veteran of 200 perfect carrier landings. Now a crash that cost Britain many orders. The vertical takeoff plane, the P-1127, was finishing a display at the Paris show when something went wrong. On the credit side, Britain has the Triton. Here she is, the VC-10, and despite a crash on test, the successor of the Viscount, the BAC-111. No year is free from tragedy, but the German mine disaster was relieved by the rescue of 3 men trapped 8 days below, and of 11 more after 14 days. To the assassination of President Kennedy, we are still too close to measure the consequences. We are left with an abiding memory of the young widow, dry-eyed, courageous, facing the long, empty years. President Kennedy was mourned as a husband, a father, a leader of all who cherish freedom. By Britain's nuclear submarine dreadnought, long underwater cruises are now a matter of routine. A captain, 10 officers and 79 ratings think nothing of 2 months without surfacing. Far longer periods could be endured if war came. At Benenden School, among 60 new girls, was Princess Anne. Until that day, she'd been taught privately. It must have been a disconcerting experience to begin school life at the ripe age of 13. Earlier in the year, the princess showed that she is not without self-confidence. Was she not the chief bridesmaid on that most pleasant day when Princess Alexandra became the wife of Mr. Angus Ogilvy? The marriage was one of the happiest occasions of a year in which so much took place. It almost symbolized our national power of recovery. The setbacks of the year are now behind us. Remembering the good things, we pass on to now. 12 months ago, it was welcome to 1964. There are no pessimists on New Year's Eve. Celebrating somewhere, no doubt, was that king of speed, Donald Campbell, all set for a do-or-die attempt to raise his world record. His wife was at Lake Eyre to see him do it. No one in the camp would think of failure. 1964 had to be Campbell's year. Sure enough, he succeeded. 403.1 miles an hour. Speed of another kind, the Indianapolis 500 mile, often the world's most killing race, more than living up to its sinister reputation. Going flat out, Dave McDonald hits the wall. Crashing into that awesome wreckage, Eddie Sachs, killed instantly. McDonald died later. When it was all over, someone said that wasn't a motor race, just plain murder. Leatherslade Farm burst into the news as the place where the train robbers hid out till they panicked and fled. Months later came the astounding sequel. Criminals broke into Winson Green Jail and released one of the robbers. In crime fiction, it would have seemed hopelessly far-fetched. Now for some legalized violence in Paris. France and Australia in the decisive test match. A crunching exhibition of organized annihilation. Sometimes there's no short way out of an argument like this. London airport crowded with teenagers. It means the Beatles back from America. Even by their own crisp standards, the Beatles will always look back to 1964 as a top pop year. For India, the year may have been a turning point. Upon Dr. Shastri fell the mantle of the great Nehru. Vast, uncommitted India prays that he may be able to wear it successfully. Nehru was dead. 74, worn out, he had been chief minister since independence in 1947. No one could quite take his place. At his cremation stood Sir Alec Douglas Hume. India may stay uncommitted, but Britain keeps up with the times, the nuclear and rocket age. At Woomera, they launched Blue Streak. Blue Streak itself will help to launch the European satellite scheduled for orbit in 2 years' time. For the man in the moon, America's Ranger 7 made 64 the year of all time. Back came the closest moon pictures ever taken. For Cupid, it was a terrific year and very royal. First, Princess Irene of the Netherlands marrying Prince Carlos. No members of her family were present, as neither her parents nor the Dutch government entirely approved of the match. Cupid's next arrow landed in Sweden, where Princess Margareta married London businessman John Ambler. Present was the bride's 81-year-old grandfather, King Gustav. The most important wedding was in Greece, where the young King Constantine married Princess Anne-Marie of Denmark. The ceremony was performed with the ancient ritual and splendor of the Greek church. Lest it be thought that Cupid went wholly royal in '64, there was the marriage of Olympic stars Robbie Brightwell and Ann Packer. Exit Cupid, enter the stork. On leap year day at Thatched House Lodge, a son was born to the very popular Princess Alexandra and Mr. Angus Ogilvy. Congratulations to them both. Princess Margaret and Lord Snowdon were blessed with a daughter. Lady Sarah was 2 months old here, on the way to her christening at Buckingham Palace. Whether on his way home the stork has to cross the Forth, who knows? But if so, he saw the new road bridge with its great centre span of 1,100 yards. Fully 100,000 people welcomed the Queen as she arrived for the royal opening. To put the event on record in another way, she signed the visitors' book. Engineered on a scale worthy of Scotland, the Forth Road Bridge is the longest suspension bridge in Europe, the motor age companion of that 75-year-old veteran, the world-famous railway bridge. Traditionally, on election night, anything goes. The spotlight was on Huyton, Harold Wilson's constituency. Not that his return was in doubt, but because he might be Premier next day.
For James Harold Wilson, 42,200.
Harold Wilson emerged as one of the top personalities of the year. But what a year for Nikita Khrushchev. Dismissed when he thought himself completely secure. Popularity deceived him. Now it's no flowers by order. The man of the year, surely Lyndon Johnson, now the elected president by the biggest majority in American history. Good luck go with him as holder of the highest office in the democratic world. The German Grand Prix, and hindsight tells us that there was prophecy in the air at the Nürburgring. A formidable challenger for top honors, driving a Ferrari, John Surtees. He won his race and later in Mexico got the points he needed to become world champion. The Olympics made the sports headlines of the year. And what a heroine was Mary Rand, setting the world record long jump. A gold medal for Mary, not to mention a silver and a bronze. For Ken Matthews, a gold for winning the 20-kilometer walk. Lynn Davis, like a good Welshman, also collected a gold in the long jump. Robbie Brightwell and Ann Packer won themselves 3 wedding presents, a silver each and a gold for Ann. In Mexico, the Duke of Edinburgh, a great personality in any year, ran true to form. In the garb of the Death Riders, quite at home in the company of those famous horsemen. We never had a finer unofficial ambassador. When the time came, he left Mexico for the Caribbean, by air, of course. There's a fascination about being 20,000 feet up over Farnborough or anywhere. Up here you can reflect, get your values right, see things in proportion. Who will be the men and women outstanding in 1965? Which nation? Which politicians? Good year or bad? It stimulates thought up here, but you can't stay long. So for 1965, good luck to us all. Let's go down and get started. He lay in state, lay in the great hall of Britain's history, he who made history and wrote it. For barely had 1965 begun, when after 90 years, Winston Churchill departed his tremendous life. Paying our tribute to this nation's greatest son was farewell to a dear friend. 2.5 hours in biting cold it took from Lambeth Bridge to Westminster Hall. A pilgrimage abundantly rewarded when our turn came to file past. Past Sir Winston Churchill, Knight of the Garter, Saviour of Britain, and with it all, the man whom everyone called Winnie. And after the lying in state came the state funeral, the highest honor the nation could now pay. From Westminster, they bore him to St. Paul's. Awaiting his mortal remains in London's cathedral were the Queen and a congregation of her former subjects and the great of almost every nation of the world. The sorrowing widow and her son led the family mourners. He lived for 90 years, lived to the full, until at last the old warrior was at rest. Churchill's world in his youth included Africa. The Blue Nile, pouring out of Lake Tana over the majestic Tifsisat Falls, one of the truly inspiring sights of the continent, was visited by the last sovereign under whom Winston served. Touring Ethiopia, Her Majesty was escorted by the Emperor Haile Selassie. On that happy occasion, neither Queen nor Emperor dreamt that when the year was ending, the shadow of Rhodesia would cloud the whole African scene. Host here to the Queen and Duke, Haile Selassie later presided over the meeting of the Organization of African Unity. There are no emperors in soccer, but Stanley Matthews was surely the prince of that great game when he at last retired. The foremost international stars were at Stoke City to mark his farewell as a first-class player. Matthews 11 versus world stars. Puskas and the rest of them would have topped $1 million on the transfer market. They were now gladly paying tribute to the greatest gentleman of the professional game. Some of these stars were unborn when the man they came to honor was of international class. What memories he had of more than 30 years in the top flight. The day had come at last for him to hang up his boots. In the front of his thoughts that day, surely Wembley Stadium. As we go over there, the Cup Final 1965, that great match, Leeds versus Liverpool, had gone into extra time with the red-shirted Merseysiders on the attack. Hunt headed Liverpool's first goal. Leeds hit back. Billy Bremner equalized. Extra time, second period. Liverpool lasting out better. Ian St. John scored the winning goal. The happiest man in football, Ron Yates, as he received the cup. If there is one trophy that can rival the FA Cup, it is the Derby Cup. Was it destined to go to France? Somewhere in the bunch, coming up the hill, was the cast-iron favourite Seabird II, which thousands of punters hoped would be first past the post. As the field swept on, Pathé's directional microphones captured the authentic, unique sounds of the Epsom Derby. Sure enough, it was victory for Seabird II. For racing of another kind, over to Cowes, where the world's keenest yachtsmen meet the challenge of the sea under sail. Apart perhaps from deep-sea ocean racers, there's nothing to equal Cowes. The Royal Yacht Squadron down there was in being more than 60 years before Winston Churchill was born. But in his 90 years, what changes, what achievements? The Cruachan Dam and its power station, for example. Who could have imagined it 90 years ago? It's the masterpiece of the North of Scotland hydroelectric scheme. Fittingly, it was inaugurated by the Queen. 1,300 feet above sea level, the dam impounds a head of water to drive the turbines. Tunneled 3/4 of a mile into the heart of Ben Cruachan is the great machine hall, generating, when Her Majesty is switched on, enough power for a town of 200,000 people. "30,000 feet over the ocean flew the Super VC-10, one of the big achievements of 1965. Sir Giles Guthrie, chairman of BOAC, piloted the aircraft on a proving flight to the United States. In the 90 years spanned by Churchill's life, aviation conquered the skies from the balloon to jetliners. Coming in over Boston, the Super VC-10 showed to America's most sophisticated city the world's most sophisticated airliner. And not only the Super VC-10s, the BAC 111 took the air to bring home the dollars. The 111 costs $1 million. Orders for 100 quickly came in, helping the export trade to boom. For the new revolutionary Mini, the demand quickly spread over 160 countries. The little car has two-pedal control. You scarcely need your left foot, except for getting in and out. You can change the gears by hand if you prefer to. At the top end of the scale, the new Rolls-Royce, the last word in luxury. And reappearing for one day only, the horseless carriages of 50 and more years ago. Veteran cameraman Ken Gordon, on the active list for the Veteran Car Run, filmed this kind of rally before World War I. With 1965 as a year of achievement, we can afford to look back to an age when these machines were something to boast about. If only Sir Winston had lived half a year longer, he would have marveled at the walk in space. For that breathtaking feat, 1965 will be notable in the annals of science, indeed in the history of mankind. Major Ed White was calmly making his way out of the capsule into space, about 200 miles above the Earth, traveling at 17,000 miles an hour, right outside the Earth's atmosphere. He and his fellow astronaut and all the Americans concerned in the space project merited the admiration of the world.
I've only put the focus down to about 8 feet or so. The flight director says get back in. This is Jim. What got a message for us? Jimmy Ford, get back in. Okay.
1965, a year in our time, a year no one will ever forget. For Britain and British aircraft, certainly a memorable year. From Super VC-10s down to private planes, Farnborough had them all. For spectacle backed by expertise, the RAF's Red Arrows are certain show stealers. The United States laid on a typical American welcome to the Duke of Edinburgh. Prince Philip was on a dual mission to help British exports and also raise money for the Variety Club, the show business children's charity. New York set out to provide the biggest and best welcome of all America. In addition to raising $1 million for Variety Club, the Duke went to see how Fifth Avenue displays British goods on behalf of the British Export to America Council. It has always been said that trade follows the flag. Nowadays, it follows the Duke, too, which makes him a perfect ambassador to trade. The Commonwealth Games brought outstanding achievements by British athletes. Brian Phelps here on a way to a gold medal. With Prince Charles and Princess Anne, the Duke saw Brian Phelps receive his gold. Jill Slattery won hers in the 220 yards breaststroke. And in the long jump, Lynn Davis consolidated his Olympics reputation with another gold for Britain. Won more gold in the women's 110 yard backstroke. The winner, Linda Lutgrove. Great achievements, too, in outer space this year. Astronaut Richard Gordon tethered the Agena target vehicle with a Dacron rope. Then back to join fellow astronaut Charles Conrad. These men maneuvered their capsule to within feet of the target vehicle, 850 miles above Earth. The splashdown, the best yet, was within half a mile of its Atlantic target. For the astronauts, a great moment as the capsule was opened and they breathed their first fresh air for 80 hours. Gordon and Conrad won their place in space exploration history. Their flight, a big step towards the landing of men on the moon. To man's exploration achievement, who can foresee a limit? After outer space came another discovery, oil under the sea. Gas from such rigs is becoming commonplace, but oil in quantity could be the brightest prospect for Britain. Early days yet, nevertheless an achievement that could add another success to the nation. No easy year 1966 for the motor industry. Maintaining sales to the world called for prodigious effort. There were new and modified models to tempt both the home buyer and world markets. It was a mouth-watering motor show, and this has been the greatest year of exports for the British motor industry, leader in the all-important trading figures. The Lord Mayor's Show. For more than 700 years, the elected first citizen has journeyed westwards from the City of London to be sworn in. On his drive from the Mansion House, the Lord Mayor passed beneath the modern buildings which now tower above the city's square mile. It's almost a new city now, yet deeply rooted in an unrivaled past. The buildings express London's increasing importance to the national economy, and in world finance, a tremendous achievement in a growingly competitive world. British democracy, based on constitutional monarchy and the mother of parliaments, has its roots in history, but marches in step with the 1960s. The state opening of Parliament. This year, the House of Commons opened its doors to film cameras for the first time. An achievement perhaps in our own field, to penetrate one of the few remaining barriers to newsreel reporters.
Mr. Speaker, the Queen commands this Honourable House to attend Her Majesty immediately in the House of Peers.
International soccer. England won the World Cup. The scoreboard at full time, then extra time. Geoff Hurst shot. The ball seemed to bounce in from the underside of the bar. It spun out again. Goal claimed England. The referee consulted the linesman, and goal it was. Not without protest from the West Germans. England 3, Germany 2. The second period of extra time, and Hurst scored for the third time. England had won the World Cup. Bobby Charlton, the emotion was too much. It was an outstanding achievement in sport. A mighty pointer to Britain's winning place in a competitive world. A year to remember, a scene to remember. Sir Francis Chichester was almost home. A welcoming armada went out from Plymouth to greet the hero who had sailed round the world in a small boat, Gypsy Moth. It was one of those truly great events of 1967. On September 20th, at Clydebank, Britain's newest liner was launched. At last, the big secret was out. She was to bear the name Queen Elizabeth II. It was a fine tribute to Her Majesty who performed the launching ceremony. The new Queen of the Seas was a proud sight. But for millions of Britain's Roman Catholics, a day in May will be the most memorable of the year, for it marked the consecration of Liverpool's Metropolitan Cathedral of Christ the King. From all over the world came representatives of the Catholic faith for the magnificent occasion. It was also a time for Britain to greet other overseas visitors. King Faisal of Saudi Arabia was one. With the Queen, His Majesty drove to Hyde Park for one of the high spots of his state visit, the review of the King's Troop Royal Horse Artillery. Another VIP visitor was Russian Prime Minister Mr. Kosygin. He made a short official stopover for talks with Mr. Wilson. On the agenda was an increase in Anglo-Russian trade and the problems of peace in Vietnam. Trade has improved, but the war still continues. In Iran, 1967 will always be a very special year. The Shah had, after 26 years, ascended the fabled peacock throne and crowned himself King of Kings. What a magnificent occasion. Queen Farah, the first woman in 2,500 years of Persian monarchy ever to be crowned, was both beautiful and magnificent. For 7-year-old Prince Reza, this day will surely be firmly fixed in his memory, as it will for the millions of Iranians who celebrated the coronation. From the glittering streets of Tehran, back to a London scene of pageantry. Arriving in the great gilded state coach at the Royal Courts of Justice was London's 640th Lord Mayor, Sir Gilbert Inglefield. As Sir Gilbert entered the law courts to take his oath of office, Londoners accepted his invitation to come and have fun. Theme of the show was the role of the city as a patron of the arts. The procession was more than a mile long. Carnivals and pretty girls go together. So do Royal Ascot and lovely women. For at this ritzy race meeting, men take second place and horses are hardly mentioned. 1967 was no exception. At Aintree, ritzy is hardly the word to describe the Grand National. Rugged is more exact. And this National was certainly that, and more. Look again at that fantastic pile-up at the jump after Beechers. Out of the shambles, one horse appeared, complete with rider, Foinaven, 100-to-1 outsider. But at the 23rd, it was chaos. Horses were going in all directions. Some jumped, some just clambered over the fence. But somehow, most of the runners got going again. A long way ahead, Foinaven, tired, slowing but unbeatable, ran for home and a £17,000 victory. It was quite a national. And at Epsom, the Derby provided its own special brand of excitement on the flat. It was a day of perfect going and superb racing as Australian jockey George Moore took Royal Palace to the front and kept him there. There's no doubting that a derby is something really special for racing enthusiasts, just as the cup final is for thousands of soccer fans. Spurs versus Chelsea, London's football derby, and Spurs into the lead. The second half, more magic moments for Tottenham. Just before the final whistle, Chelsea got a well-deserved goal. But it was all over bar the shouting. Tottenham Hotspur had won the cup. Grand teamwork had been rewarded, as it was at Toulouse, where test pilots Brian Trubshaw and André Turcat saw Concorde make its public debut. For Mr. Wedgwood Benn, Minister of Technology, and Monsieur Jean Chamon, French Minister of Transport, a very proud occasion. The Anglo-French brainchild, born out of the collaboration of two nations, was the envy of the world. The highlight of a year of highlights.
(1968), a year of change, a year of protest. Protest through vocal but orderly demonstration, and protest through murderous lunacy. Robert Kennedy, murdered in June, not long after the assassination of Martin Luther King. Man, unable to control the violence of his own world, still seeks to conquer worlds beyond. Prelude to the Christmas moon trip, Shearer, Isley and Cunningham win a vital stage in the race to the moon. But Yuri Gagarin is dead. Killed in a plane crash, he was the very first to face the hazards of space. At home, other hazards in high places. Since the collapse of Ronan Point, residents in similar tower blocks can hardly continue to feel safe as houses. And after a lifetime on high, death in Tasmania for star of the high wire, Adrian Labanz. Anticipating its end by demolition, a 5-story building in Australia collapses in flames. The terrible Glasgow warehouse fire in which more than 20 died. Early in the year, fire at a petrochemical works near Paris, started by a night watchman who admitted a grudge against society. We have a grudge about our weather, but we could do nothing about this. With more than 1,000 square miles underwater, the southeast won't easily forget September and the worst flooding for 15 years. The people of Sicily won't forget their ordeal by earthquake, the worst for 60 years. Over 300 people lost their lives. And the people of Persia will remember the worst earthquake in their country's history. Here, the dead were numbered in thousands. In 1968, the RAF celebrated its 50th anniversary. Following the defense cuts, they faced the next half-century with considerably less confidence. But what money we saved on defense, we soon threw away on strikes and lost exports. Whether we call them old or new pennies, we still can't balance the books. The coins that more than held their value were gold ones found by a lorry driver and auctioned for £85,000. We did make a couple of million selling London Bridge and the Queen Elizabeth to America, but we had to find 30 million to build the new Queen. Still, she is the most advanced passenger ship in the world. In August, Princess Margaret inaugurated the first cross-channel hover service with the largest hovercraft in the world. De Gaulle got his own back with the announcement of delays on the Anglo-French Concorde.
But while Concorde was earthbound, some aviators had their heads in the clouds. A couple in Poland celebrated their wedding with a parachute jump. Jackie Kennedy flew off to Scorpius to marry Harry, while Linda Ludgrove stayed at home to be in the swim. Liberal leader Jeremy Thorpe married Caroline Allpass, and that most liberal of blondes, Diana Dawes, chose Alan Lake as husband number 3. And 97-year-old Charlie Brown married his childhood sweetheart. He'd taken 75 years to make up his mind. Pop star Mark Winter nearly didn't marry his Australian bride. He'd just taken off from London in a BOAC Boeing when the plane caught fire. A fine bit of piloting brought the plane down, and 120 passengers and crew lived to tell of their miraculous escape. Not one of the 48 people on board a British Eagle Viscount survived this terrible crash in Bavaria in August. An amateur cameraman captured these pictures of disaster, an Elizabethan freighter crashing at London Airport. Ordeal by hurricane for the New Zealand ferry Wahine, which foundered near the entrance to Wellington Harbour. 51 lives were lost. The big South Coast sea drama was the Norwegian tanker Sittekund lying smouldering just off Eastbourne, the whole town liable to go west. But it was a South Sea greengrocer who stole the maritime headlines, round-the-world yachtsman Sir Alec Rose. To celebrate, Lord Nelson had his first decent clean-up since they put him on his column. But setting his world underground record, Mike Meany from Tipperary didn't wash for 61 days. Gunman Wally Mellish held out 8 days in Sydney, keeping the police at bay until the siege was broken. The Shropshire gunman, John James, lasted 17 days at Weston-under-Red Castle before his family grabbed the gun and brought him to his senses. In spite of the fearless talks, Harold Wilson still couldn't bring Ian Smith to his way of thinking, and the siege of Rhodesia went on. Earlier in the year, Britain imposed something like siege conditions to prevent the influx of Asians from Kenya. Squeezed out of Africa, unwanted in Britain, pawns on the chessboard of politics. In Paris, politics and diplomacy eventually assembled all parties to try to find peace in Vietnam. Possibly the worst blow to American morale, the Viet Cong guerrilla campaign in the very heart of Saigon. But even all the bloodshed of Southeast Asia couldn't obliterate the crime against humanity when Russia broke faith with Dubček to break the spirit of the freedom seekers of Czechoslovakia. These were the first pictures to be released of the Russian invasion. Occupation struck at the very heart of national liberty. But one heartbeat will sound through history, the miracle of transplant pioneer Dr. Chris Barnard. The longest surviving heart transplant patient is Philip Bleiberg. Soon afterwards, the first heart transplant in Britain was performed by a team led by Mr. Donald Ross. Of course, affairs of the heart aren't only surgical. Chi-Chi and Annan were two of the biggest disappointments of the year. But one heart stealer made up for it, London's first baby polar bear since Brumas. While the kids enjoyed Pipalook, Dad got an eyeful of Penny Plummer, the librarian from Sydney. If only the world were as beautiful as the girl who wears its crown. Maybe that's the most lasting reflection on 1968, the year when protest raised its voice louder and wider than ever before. Against intolerance, as in Prague and Londonderry. Against racial prejudice, as in America or nearer home. Against war, as in Vietnam and Biafra. Against the institutions and sacred cows of society, as in France. Against leaders and the establishment. Against authority and rigid, unimaginative regulations. foolish to deny that disorder is the weapon of communist agitation, but equally foolish to regard all young demonstrators as just revolting students.
Well, I gotta get the world off of my back. Oh, pretty soon I'm gonna crack. So I gotta get the world off my back. Somehow, Dave, I'm sitting here thinking about the poems I used to write when I was just a little boy. I thought that when I grew up, everything would be just fine. Fancy clothes, cigars, driving fast cars. But now I've grown up, and I gotta get the world off of my back. My mind is beginning to go black. So I gotta get the world off my back. Somehow, Dave, I grew up and looked around me and I saw that the world was in a mess. Thousands of hungry people, children starving, wars, injustice, and everybody kept picking on me. So I gotta get the world off my back. Oh, pretty soon I'm gonna crack. So I gotta get the world off of my back. Somehow, Dave. So I gotta get the world off my back. My mind is beginning to go black. So I gotta get the world off my back. Somehow, Dave, I got rent to pay and I can hardly afford to keep my kids and my wife. My Texas life just ain't worth living now.
I, Charles, Prince of Wales, do become your liege man of life and limb, and of earthly worship. And faith and truth I will bear unto thee, to live and die against all manner of folks.
All Wales welcomed Prince Charles as their own. This day, July the 1st, 1969, with its fanfares, its colour and royal dignity, is one that will long be remembered. It was perhaps the crowning occasion of a year which saw the emergence of Prince Charles and Princess Anne as active, indeed working members of the royal family. The ancient castle of Carnarvon became the focal point for millions. The ceremony of investiture, a symbol of the pride we have in our traditions and our royal family. In keeping with modern times, they have come closer to their peoples than ever before. It has been a busy, full year for the Queen and her family. We present some of its highlights. At Spithead, the Royal Yacht Britannia steamed proudly between the lines of NATO ships. One by one, they saluted the passing royal vessel. On board, the excitement of the occasion was shared with Princess Anne and Earl Mountbatten. A few weeks later, there was another nautical occasion at Tor Bay. The aircraft carrier HMS Eagle, flagship of the Western Fleet, lay at anchor surrounded by 38 sister ships. The fleet was to receive its new colours from Her Majesty. The ceremony was performed in one of the carrier's vast hangars. It was followed by a fly-past. Out in the North Sea, the natural gas rig Amoco B welcomed Princess Anne aboard. She added a very feminine touch to the, until then, men-only rig. After changing into more suitable clothes, the princess saw for herself what goes on far from shore in the business of bringing Britain's new gas supply home. It was an informal, relaxed occasion and a personal success for the young princess. At Windsor Castle, the splendor of a formal event was typified by the state visit of President Giuseppe Saragat of Italy. Not for 60 years had the magnificent castle been used by a reigning monarch for such an occasion. The President and his daughter had come in friendship to be welcomed with equal cordiality by the Queen and her family on behalf of the nation. During the year, there were several royal visits overseas. A memorable one was to Austria, where the friendship between our two countries was further cemented by the Queen and Prince Philip. This was the first visit by British royalty to Austria for over half a century, an event which the Austrians made particularly memorable with a gift to the Queen of 2 Haflinger ponies. The many receptions were on a lavish scale. Princess Anne attended her first cup final. From the royal box, she watched Leicester and Manchester City duel for the coveted trophy. The only goal in the match was a beauty. Neil Young clinched the game for Manchester City. Joe Mercer's great team stepped up to receive the cup from the young princess, whose introduction to cup final football couldn't have been better. North of the border, history was made in Edinburgh on the day when the Queen, accompanied by the Duke and Princess Anne, drove through the city streets to attend a General Assembly of the Church of Scotland. This was the first time since the union of the Scottish and English crowns in 1603 that a reigning sovereign would be present at such an assembly. With her husband and daughter close by, the Queen addressed the assembly with a message of hope for peace. It was in quest of world peace that President Nixon visited many countries after taking office. In London, he was informally invited to Buckingham Palace, where, during a family luncheon, as he said himself, he was captivated by the friendship and hospitality. 3 other famous Americans were also received at Buckingham Palace during the year. They were the man-on-the-moon team of Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Mike Collins. Armstrong, the first man on the moon, led the way at this historic meeting. Like the people of Britain, the royal family were proud to greet the space trio, especially so with Prince Edward and Prince Andrew. The Queen and Duke showed a keen knowledge and interest in the American moon program. The astronauts and their wives were made to feel very much at home. Once more, it was the turn of the Queen and her family to be welcomed to another country. At Bergen, in Norway, King Olaf received his visitors as they disembarked from the royal yacht. An irrepressible Prince Edward watched from Britannia as the Queen inspected the Guard of Honor. First stop in Bergen, on what was a holiday itinerary, was the house of Edvard Grieg, the great Norwegian composer. Another visit proved highly entertaining for all the family when the seals at Bergen Aquarium put on their own version of an aqua show. Horse racing is one of the Queen's favorite sports, and one of her happiest duties is to attend the Derby. Derby Day 1969 was cold and windy, but the weather couldn't cool the enthusiasm of the big crowd as the runners and riders made their way out onto the track. A day at the races is a pastime in which Her Majesty derives as much pleasure as many of her subjects. But one of the most memorable occasions in a busy royal year was one shared by thousands, visitors and Londoners alike. On a sunny day in June, the Queen celebrated her official birthday. The colour had been trooped. The soldiers marched back from Horse Guards Parade to Buckingham Palace. In their magnificent dress uniforms, the soldiers played their immaculate part. But this was also a day when the traditional and the modern were brought together. The British Concorde came to London. There was much excitement on the balcony of the palace as the roar of 16 RAF Lightnings heralded the arrival of Concorde 002. As ever, it had been a busy year in the Royal Guard. But what made it a special year was the shouldering of royal duties by Prince Charles and Princess Anne. Two young people became more and more an important part of a modern monarchy.